The initial rejection was a profound psychological blow for George D. Wilson. He had sought the crisp certainty of the Navy or the martial pride of the Marines. But his eyesight was deemed inadequate for either service. Instead, the Army claimed him on September 19, 1942. He was thrown into the stifling, insect-ridden inertia of basic training in the Louisiana swamps. The training was limited, and the days were long. The environment was one of pathological boredom, punctuated by bursts of exhausting, aimless exertion. He was bored and exhausted, but he was certainly not prepared. The Army, hemorrhaging experienced officers, sought to fill the void rapidly. This crisis catalyzed the expansion of Officer Candidate School, or OCS. The OCS program turned into a high-pressure filter for leadership. After a rigorous board interview, Wilson was accepted into the program. It was a crucible designed to forge leaders in just 90 days. The popular narrative of the time, often perpetuated by West Point graduates, derided OCS men as 90-day wonders. This was a dismissive term suggesting quick, inferior training. But the reality was far more intense than the slur suggested. OCS was a relentless psychological gauntlet engineered to break men down. It sought to rebuild them with reflexive command instincts. The school was less concerned with academic strategy than with ensuring a man could issue an order and lead the charge when faced with chaos. This intense, compressed training was the only preparation men like Wilson would receive before facing the brutal realities of the hedgerows. He was commissioned a second lieutenant on May 8, 1943. Nearly a year later, in April 1944, he was ordered to Camp Shanks, New York. From there, the vast, terrifying scope of the war became real. It took the form of a troop ship plunging into the North Atlantic. The transatlantic voyage was a misery of overcrowding and uncertainty. Men were packed below deck, stacked 4 deep in narrow metal bunks. The air was thick with diesel fumes and the sour smell of fear. Once the vessel left the shelter of the harbour, the North Atlantic asserted its dominance. The ship was mercilessly tossed by high seas, pitching violently in a mechanical struggle against the elements. The constant, sickening motion left hundreds of soldiers incapacitated. They were vomiting into helmets or mess kits. The decks were slick with brine, and the general malaise was profound. For days they existed in a state of suspended animation. The only certainty was the violent roll of the vessel and the terrifying knowledge that unseen U-boats prowled the freezing waters below. This journey ended with his arrival in Liverpool on April 20, 1944. It was the first true, visceral separation from home. It was a physical and psychological ordeal that confirmed the theoretical war was now a cold, vast ocean away. The arrival in France in late June 1944 was a violent immersion. It was a landscape fundamentally altered by war. Wilson arrived on July 12 to join the 22nd Infantry Regiment of the 4th Infantry Division. He stepped off the transport and immediately into a brutal, unromantic reality. This was a reality military training had failed to predict. The immediate enemy was not solely the German soldier. It was the French countryside itself. Normandy's bocage to the network of ancient, towering hedgerows transformed every field into a defensive fortress. This terrain granted the Germans perfect cover. It forced Allied infantry to advance through narrow, exposed gaps. This tactical nightmare necessitated immediate, brutal innovation. To counter the problem, engineers rapidly developed and welded hedgerow sides, jagged steel teeth to the front of Sherman tanks. This allowed the tanks to rip through the earthen walls rather than expose their vulnerable underbellies on the roads. The war was already rewriting its own rulebook. Colonel Buck Lanham, the regimental commander, offered no comfort. His briefing was a cold, stark assessment of their prospects. Officers were expected to lead from the front. Casualties would be high. The survival of the first battle was the only metric that mattered. Perhaps if they lived, a promotion might follow. Wilson's first combat engagement occurred on July 26, 1944. It coincided with the massive preparatory bombing raid for the St. Lo breakthrough. From a sheltered position, he had a grandstand view of the aerial spectacle. Hundreds of huge bombers arrived in wave after wave. Their purpose was to carpet bomb the German lines into submission. It was an awesome sight, yet the reality on the ground was catastrophic. The mission was plagued by miscalculations, resulting in a devastating friendly fire incident. 500-pound bombs fell short. They killed or wounded over 800 American troops. The air, already heavy with the dust of destruction, was now thick with the awful, sickening odor of death. This smell was intensified by the hot July sun. The landscape was instantly transformed into a moonscape of destruction. Bomb craters were large enough to swallow a jeep hole. The baptism of fire was a terrifying, visceral shock. Wilson found himself in a slam-bang tank duel in St. Gilles. He was caught between two firing tanks in a narrow, walled-in street. The noise was deafening, the space acting like a sound tunnel. Muzzle blasts shattered windows. The concussion nearly knocked his helmet off. In a moment of intense tension, he fired his M1 rifle at a charging German commander. He realized the weapon was empty, highlighting his utter vulnerability and inexperience. The theoretical concepts of warfare dissolved instantly into the visceral act of killing. It was replaced by the immediate, desperate question of survival. He knew he had to adapt or die. He made an intense effort to learn the names of all 40 men in his platoon. He realized the necessity of personal connection and leading from the absolute front. This proved crucial, but the chaos continued unabated. Following the tank duel, a tragic friendly fire incident unfolded. 105mm artillery struck their own troops. It was a chaotic nightmare that caused many casualties. It included a sergeant who was buried alive by a passing tank. The constant psychological and physical attrition demanded immediate self-preservation. Wilson realized he needed to build a protective shield within himself to cope with the mounting losses. This became especially true after the death of his second man. This brutal, localized fighting culminated in the catastrophic disaster known as the Massacre of Villebourdon Ridge. During this engagement, 9 out of 17 Sherman tanks were demolished. The infantry was almost wiped out. A flawed artillery signal, the use of red smoke led to tragic misidentification and friendly fire. This occurred under the superior firepower of German 88mm artillery. E Company was reduced to about 27 men from an original 168. Wilson's own platoon saw only 6 survivors from 40. The intense fighting and destruction left the ruins of Villebourdon torn apart by savage battle. The physical and psychological toll was immense. The exhaustion and constant danger led to troops becoming psychiatric cases. They experienced fear-induced paralysis. The limitations of theoretical infantry training were starkly exposed. They had not prepared the men for understrength units and unexpected enemy tactics, yet, amid the carnage, individual resilience shone. The platoon medic was wounded by a sniper while tending to a radio man. Despite the injury, he calmly dressed his own wound and remained in action. He was only killed later during an ambulance incident. The Saint-Lô breakthrough itself, completed by August 2nd, was the pivot point. It opened up France for Allied pursuit. It enabled the rapid advance of forces, including Patton's Third Army. But the advance was not clean or rational. Wilson recounted a harrowing night bombing raid. Soldiers were vulnerable under brilliant parachute flares. They experienced the visceral terror of bombs falling, feeling the air crushed from their lungs. Later, Wilson felt misused by the constant leading role he was given. Despite this, he was presented with a Silver Star by Major General Barton. It was a recognition of bravery, often intertwined with sheer, terrifying luck. The relentless pursuit of the retreating Wehrmacht continued. It necessitated the crossing of the Seine River. The river's depth and swift current presented a major logistical hurdle. The first attempt, utilizing vulnerable pontoon boats, resulted in disaster. 2/3 of a battalion was lost. Only a successful subsequent crossing allowed the advance to proceed. This was aided by the ingenious strategy of a retired French naval captain. This momentum led directly to the Falaise Gap encirclement. It was a catastrophic defeat for the German army. The scale of the destruction was unprecedented. Thousands of Germans were caught. Their dead bodies were stacked high. Roads were littered with hundreds of burning tanks, trucks, and wagons. It was dramatic proof of the devastating power of Allied air superiority and logistics. The culmination of these efforts was the liberation of Paris on August 25, 1944. The symbolic victory was overwhelming. The city, which had endured 4 years of occupation, erupted in an overwhelming wave of euphoria. Parisians went insane with jubilation. They formed a solid wall of humanity, shouting and cheering. They tossed flowers, candy, and wine. It was a moment of profound relief and triumph. It was a brief, shining contrast to the darkness of the hedgerows. It offered respite from the psychological scarring incurred during the Normandy crucible. The war, however, was far from over. The rapid advance would soon push the soldiers into the unknown dangers of the German frontier. The liberation of Paris, a moment of intoxicating, overwhelming triumph, receded quickly. It disappeared behind the screech of tires and the rising dust of the pursuit. The Allied advance across France became a relentless, ill-prepared dash. It pushed exhausted soldiers into unknown territory. The enemy was often unseen but always present. This was not the grand, sweeping maneuver celebrated in headlines. It was a grueling succession of small arms engagements against German rear echelon troops. It was characterized by constant vigilance against booby traps and desperate ambushes. The speed of the advance frequently overshadowed tactical prudence. This left units dangerously exposed. The volatility of the newly liberated civilian population added a complex layer of tension. The initial surge of French gratitude had been palpable. There were shouts, cheers, and kisses thrown by young girls. But that euphoria was often tempered by the harsh realities of vengeance. In several towns, the troops witnessed swift, brutal justice. Kangaroo courts dispensed retribution to suspected collaborators. This was a stark, uncomfortable reminder that the war's moral landscape was far from clean. The men learned quickly that the confusion of rapid movement invited danger. Near Paris, Wilson's platoon narrowly avoided an ambush. The incident was so close that it took many weeks before the men let a certain sergeant forget his brief, happy encounter with a French girl just hours before. As the pursuit pressed eastward, the atmosphere tightened palpably. The warm, welcoming faces of Belgian civilians began to look nervous. They were filled with uncertainty and fear as the German homeland drew near. The discovery of hidden German supply depots signaled an end to the chase. These were vast stores of materiel intended for a prolonged defense. The looming presence of the Siegfried Line fortifications signaled the beginning of entrenched, brutal confrontation. The constant, unseen threat culminated in a surreal moment in an open sugar beet field. The platoon was ordered forward there as a sacrificial offering. There, a bouncing Betty anti-personnel mine nearly wiped out the patrol. This weapon instilled profound, lasting fear with its two-stage explosion and scattering ball bearings. It underscored the inhuman precision of the enemy's defences. On September 12, 1944, the 22nd Infantry Regiment crossed the German border. Colonel Lanham, the regimental commander, viewed the Siegfried Line not as an obstacle, but as an opportunity. His aggressive strategy focused on exploiting the known weaknesses of the concrete pillboxes. These were their vulnerable rear entrances. The plan utilized flamethrowers and satchel charges. It turned the massive fortifications into death traps once breached. The 3rd Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel Teague, executed the plan with brutal efficiency. They achieved a successful penetration of the Siegfried Line. They created a small, vital hole that was quickly widened into a wedge. This tactical victory, the breach of Hitler's supposedly invincible Western Wall, provided a brief, intense moment of unit pride. But the advance died almost immediately. It was strangled by the very logistics that had enabled the rapid push across France. The breakthrough was catastrophically halted due to a severe lack of supplies. Gas and ammunition were critically low. This prevented any exploitation of the penetration. Eisenhower's strategic decision for pencilite thrusts had an immediate, devastating human cost. These thrusts were aimed at conserving resources for other fronts. The tactical success was transformed into a static, deadly holding operation. Rumors circulated bitterly among the exhausted frontline troops. They claimed supply favoritism was being shown to Patton's Third Army. This fueled a deep sense of betrayal and helplessness. The men endured over a week in defensive positions. They spent tense days on point without adequate supplies. This was a stark contrast to the theoretical comfort of the rear echelons. The price of this logistical mismanagement was swiftly demonstrated. It was shown by the catastrophic attack on the Sellerich crossroads. There, the 90th Division's tank infantry advance was caught in a devastating artillery barrage. 45 minutes of painful advance were wiped out in less than 5. The fields were left littered with dead and wounded. The psychological toll was immediate and profound. Soldiers grappled with fear and stress. This was exemplified by Sergeant Hester's visible breakdown upon receiving a Dear John letter. It was a small, personal tragedy, magnified by the surrounding carnage. The experience revealed that the myth of the Siegfried Line's invincibility was just that, a myth. The line could be breached. Its effectiveness, however, was magnified tenfold by the Allied supply failures and strategic indecision. The inability to push decisively to the Rhine in September, when the breach was fresh, was a strategic error. Wilson believed this error would cost countless lives. It prolonged the attritional warfare that defined the coming months. The human cost of the stalled advance was already being paid in blood. It underscored the critical link between logistics and military success. The tactical victory of the penetration was constrained by the lack of fuel and shells. Ultimately, this prevented a decisive breakthrough that might have saved thousands of lives. The stalled offensive at the Siegfried Line forced the war into a new, grinding phase. It was defined by intelligence gathering and attrition. George Wilson was promoted to first lieutenant on his 23rd birthday, September 29, 1944. He was shifted from direct combat to strategic planning as the Battalion Intelligence Officer, or S2. This new role demanded a different kind of courage. It required dictating patrol priorities and studying maps diligently. It meant sending men, often reluctantly, sometimes fearfully, into the darkness. Their mission was to capture prisoners and locate enemy positions. In the rugged, forested terrain of the Schnee Eifel, Wilson spent his days preparing missions. He moved patrols from tree to tree, from cover to cover. He was playing Indian for real, always close behind the lead scout. The greatest, most insidious threat of this phase was the anti-personnel mine. The men described these as the most frightening weapon of the war. These were vicious, deadly, and inhuman devices. Some were crudely handmade from cottage cheese crocks, with minimal metal content. They were planted inches below the soil and covered by leaves or natural growth. This made them nearly invisible to standard detectors. The constant, gnawing fear of dismemberment fundamentally altered soldier behavior and tactics. Each probe with a trench knife, done in the blackout woods, felt like it could be a man's last. The horrifying reality was brought home when a 6-man patrol stepped on mines. 5 men lost limbs and 1 soldier was killed outright. It was a scene of carnage that underscored the unforgiving nature of the ground itself. These pencil-like penetrations, failing to gain support, led to a holding operation that bled the American forces dry. The entire 4th Division was soon shifted north of Branchade. They were preparing for a concentrated assault on what would become the bloodiest, most strategically questionable battle of the Western Front, the Hurtgen Forest. The Hurtgen was a special hell. It was a rugged roller coaster country of steep hills and deep ravines. It was covered in dense, 25-foot-tall referation pines. The Germans held every advantage. They had prepared positions, intimate knowledge of the terrain, and formidable bunkers. The strategic imperative for this costly effort remained questionable to the men who were dying there. It was based on fears of dam breaches or German counter-offensives. The attrition was immediate and devastating. Captain Flanagan was killed. All other officers were wounded. Battalion headquarters itself suffered severe casualties. Lieutenant Colonel Walker and his entire staff were incapacitated. The devastating turnover of leadership thrust Wilson into the role of commander. He initially felt inadequate for company command. He found himself commanding F Company. His objective was to reach the edge of the woods southwest of Groschau, approximately 1,500 yards ahead. In a critical moment, Wilson challenged the planned attack formation, despite his newness to command. He argued that attacking in a dispersed line as planned would be a major mistake. The dense pines made control impossible. Communications were non-existent. The shortage of experienced officers and non-coms guaranteed chaos. He proposed attacking in a column of platoons to maintain control. This would allow them to punch through quickly before heavy shelling could begin. The new colonel, willing to listen to a frontline veteran, accepted the revised plan. Yet chaos reigned regardless. The attack began with confusion. The lead platoon retreated headlong back to us like frightened deer. They claimed they had encountered a big German tank. The tank was a log sticking out over a stump. A few moments later, the company found itself in a gully that immediately came under heavy fire. The relentless German shelling was overwhelming. The tree bursts that sent shrapnel downwards, like rain, were infinitely more lethal than direct hits. The pressure was unbearable. The new company commander broke down in tears. This prompted Wilson to relieve him and assume full command. The price of every yard was paid in blood. Wilson watched a nervous new recruit, Lieutenant Smith, die shortly after arriving. Wilson himself sustained a wound to his forearm from shrapnel. It was a constant reminder that the margin of survival was razor-thin. The grinding battle for Groschau tested the absolute limits of human endurance. Wilson grappled with the grim reality that some soldiers sought wounds. They saw injury as a means to escape to the relative comfort of hospital beds and 3 hot meals a day. This psychological toll manifested in shocking ways. One of his radiomen began sobbing hysterically. He declared himself a dirty, no-good, yellow Jewish SOB in a seemingly genuine emotional breakdown. Only later did Wilson realize the breakdown was staged. It was a deception orchestrated with his partner to escape combat. Wilson marveled at the soldiers' theatrical talent while raging at the betrayal. The final push for the 2-block village of Groschau was planned for a risky night infiltration. Colonel Kennan, the battalion commander, conveyed the urgency at the command post. He gave Wilson a cup of coffee, as though to the condemned. Despite the shortage of experienced officers and the influx of raw recruits, the infiltration was surprisingly quiet. They moved along the edge of the woods. To Wilson's immense surprise, not a shot was fired as they entered the town. The ghostly shape of Groschau had beckoned. Its unexpected capture, achieved with minimal resistance, provided a desperate temporary victory. But the false sense of security evaporated at dawn. F Company was ordered to attack across an open field. It was approximately 800 yards to their objective. The sky fell in. They were subjected to an overwhelming German barrage. About 100 shells impacted a small area in a matter of minutes. Wilson was trapped in a shell hole under intense mortar fire. He called this his single worst experience of the war. The company suffered horrific losses. 138 men out of 150 were lost in 24 hours. Only 78 survivors remained. An armoured infantry captain's critical map misidentification had exposed them to devastating German fire. It was a failure of higher command to heed on-the-ground intelligence. This underscored the pervasive bitterness felt by the frontline survivors. Wilson was physically and emotionally exhausted. He had to be supported by Supply Sergeant O'Malley upon leaving the shell-splintered, mutilated forest. The move to Luxembourg on December 4th felt like a release from a long prison sentence. This respite was illusory. Allied High Command had gambled on a thin defensive line. It was held by only 5 divisions along the Belgian, Luxembourg, and German borders. The Battle of the Bulge began 2 weeks later. It caught Allied forces catastrophically unprepared. Wilson's company was now the isolated bottom hinge of the German breakthrough. They faced a massive, desperate surprise offensive. The enemy was not just the Germans, it was the extreme winter itself. Over a foot of snow fell in 24 hours. Night temperatures plummeted to 10 below zero. The lack of proper winter equipment was devastating. They had no hoods, no earmuffs, insufficient socks, and tight lacing boots. This led to a near epidemic of trench foot and widespread suffering. Survival hinged on ingenuity. Men carried canteens under coats to prevent freezing. They designed foxholes to trap body heat. F Company's survival during the massive German assault hinged on effective artillery. The attack appeared to be at least a full battalion attack with double tank support. Colonel Kennan orchestrated massive barrages. The sound of 16 rounds per battery was described as sweet music and more deliverance than conquest, yet the German screaming memes, 6-barreled rockets terrorized the men. They were launched with a shrill, eerie screech. Lieutenant Lloyd, the company's experienced officer, proved crucial. He used compass readings and precise timing to direct Allied artillery to silence the launchers. The immense losses in the Hurtgen and the initial stages of the Bulge created a critical shortage of experienced personnel. The army deployed ersatz Americans. These were poorly trained replacements. They had often only been to the rifle range once. They lacked proficiency with bazookas, mortars, or machine guns. This deficiency was a deadly liability. It increased non-battle casualties. One such case was a rifle grenade accident in the kitchen. It was caused by a forgotten safety pin. It resulted in 17 wounded. Wilson immediately initiated intensive training for these new men. He knew their lives, and his own depended on it. F Company endured 5 days and nights of brutal weather. They were finally relieved on Christmas Eve, 1944. The arrival of cooks with a warm meal and hot coffee was a moment of profound relief. But the cycle continued. With the influx of green replacements, the struggle for survival and the need for rigorous training began anew. It highlighted the army's logistical and training shortcomings. They were facing Hitler's desperate, costly final gamble. The brief respite of rest and recreation in Paris offered not so much rejuvenation as stark contrast. Arriving in dead winter, Wilson felt like an interloper in the metropolis. The city was still reeling from occupation. The euphoric tidal wave of the liberation had subsided. It left behind the black market and the high prices of survival. He saw the warm, beautiful neighborhood villages and the sidewalk cafes, but he also saw the cost of the war etched into the landscape beyond the city limits. The devastating evidence of the Battle of the Bulge was everywhere. Bastogne had been levelled except for a few skeletal sidewalls. St. Vich showed 5 huge bomb craters in a small area. This was dramatic proof of the overwhelming firepower unleashed. Despite the exhaustion, the war machine demanded more. The 4th Division was ordered to re-establish the critical breach in the Siegfried Line. This mission culminated in the costly assault on Hill 553. It was a battle fought not just against the enemy's formidable log bunkers and wicked 88mm rifles. It was fought against the elements. Tanks and tank destroyers struggled with traction on the thawing ground and icy roads. Crews were forced to dig trenches to gain purchase on the 6 inches of compacted snow and ice. The air was filled with the screaming overhead of Nebelwerfer shells. It was also filled with the stunning shockwaves of German fire. It was during this brutal push that Lieutenant Gessner, an SS Kastoff, distinguished himself. He was a tough infantryman. He used every weapon from an M1 rifle to a Thompson 45 caliber submachine gun. He fought hand-to-hand in the trenches. The arbitrary cruelty of this phase of fighting was soon laid bare. In early February 1945, near Obermellen, the troops made a devastating discovery. American prisoners tied up with telephone wire had been abandoned by the Germans. They were subsequently killed by friendly artillery fire. It was a tragedy that underscored the indiscriminate horror of a war that consumed its own. On that same day, February 8, the unpredictable nature of death claimed Captain Arthur Newcomb. Newcomb was Wilson's best friend and highly respected commander. Newcomb was entering a building while leading an attack when a shell struck the doorway. It killed him instantly. His death was a violent punctuation mark on the psychological toll of the attrition. Later that same afternoon, Wilson's own luck ran out on the road to Obermellen. As artillery shells began